like talking about nesting season, right? So it's not as though we can cover everything in one talk. So we're really just going to try to hit the highlights. And I guess I just wanted to acknowledge at the beginning just how broad and how intricate and widespread it is. And when we think of nesting, I think it's important to remember that, you know, you have to kind of put that in the context of what's happening in the hemisphere. And so this graphic, some of y'all may have seen before, especially if you attended my talk, and I know Nolan includes this in a lot of his talks, where it shows the annual migration, and this should be animated. So you should be seeing little dots move as this kind of plays through, but it's showing the kind of annual migration for over 100 species that occur across the hemisphere. And I think the take-home message is that a lot of the birds that we think of as our birds only spend a short period of time in South Carolina. Some of them only are here for a couple of weeks as they move through. Some come here just to nest. Some come here just for the winter. And then we have those birds that like never leave Seabrook Island, right? So there's some that are very, very sedentary. And so it runs the whole gamut. And I think it's important to acknowledge that because it makes the work that we all do a little more difficult when we share these, a lot of our birds we share with other places. So you're going to hear us talk a lot tonight about the nesting process and the nesting season and how you can help nesting birds. But it's also, I think, worth mentioning that a lot of those birds leave and they go to other places that also need our help. And so we term that full life cycle conservation, which is protecting birds during the nesting season, the wintering season, throughout their migration, and especially for a lot of these birds that you see migrate thousands of miles from year to year. And that includes a lot of the birds that do nest on Seabrook Island. So a little bit about nesting season at a very broad level, and then we're gonna dive in and start talking about some of the birds that nest specifically out on Seabrook. So a couple of things I wanted to just mention here. One is phenology. So phenology, as I'm sure a lot of y'all know, sort of it has to do with the timing and the factors that influence the timing. In this case, it's the timing of bird nesting. And that timing changes between species. So you're going to hear us talking about birds tonight that start breeding in March and others that start breeding in April. Some maybe don't start until May or June. I was actually just looking up cedar waxwings. Some of y'all may have noticed that there have been a lot of cedar waxwings lingering in South Carolina. And so I can't explain that this is the reason why, but a lot of cedar waxwings don't nest until later in the summer months. And so perhaps their migration can be longer delayed because they aren't nesting until later, sort of later in what we might call the nesting season. Generally, for a lot of birds, that nesting season obviously plays out in the spring and summer when food items are more available. But when you start looking into phenology for each species, you'll see that it changes between groups of birds, even between individual birds, and even within the range of a bird. So if this gets into that nesting range, we may see a different phenology based on which part of the breeding range you're in. So if we look at something like an eastern bluebird, where it nests here in South Carolina, might occur at one time of the year, where it nests somewhere in Illinois or somewhere like that, may be a little bit different. So we see that those differences in phenology, and you'll hear that kind of timing of nesting come up throughout the night of the presentation. I kind of mentioned nesting range. Courtship is something that we're going to talk a little bit about tonight, but you all know that that's an important part of the nesting process. It kind of gets everything going, and we see such a wide range of amazing courtship behaviors. In fact, I'm thinking now that a good presentation might just be on courtship, because as some of y'all know, we see that run the whole gamut. Here we see a great egret in the photo here, and I think somebody give me a head nod. Do we have great egrets nesting out on Seabrook Island? If they are, do we? Maybe yes or no? I can only see like Nancy's. Okay, Nancy, you'll have to be my my go-to, because you're the box that I see the easiest. So something like the great, so obviously we know this, these intricate breeding plumes that we see of the great egret. We see things like stick bringing and handing off of sticks among the wading birds, other sorts of interesting displays. But wow, I mean, I'm sure if we pulled it off of mute and everybody weighed in, we would all come up with a different species and a different courtship display that we know. I mean, some of the ones that come to my mind are things like prairie chickens dancing on leks to try to win access to a female, or we think about cranes dancing and bugling during their migration. Terns handing off food to one another. I don't want to steal your thunder, Nolan, but it's just a very intricate part. You'll see us touch on a lot of it tonight, but that is a very important part that leads up into the actual building of the nest, the laying of the eggs, the rearing of the nestlings, and the fledging of the young. And then lastly, I'll just mention, you'll hear some different terminology tonight. We'll try to define that as we go along and try to make that clear, but I put lek in here. I don't think lek is going to come up tonight, but it's at least one of those terms that we use when we do think about the breeding season, where you have multiple males staging in one spot where the females watch them display. So for some of y'all, a bird that comes to my mind are things like manakins down in Latin America and in Central America. And then I mentioned prairie chickens. Clutch, brood, scrape. You'll hear some of these different terms. A lot of these are referring to different aspects of either the building of the nest, the raising of the young, the laying of the eggs. So as we go along, we're going to try to define some of those. But if we are not clear, please, again, questions in the chat. We'll try to clarify as we go along. And I think, Nolan, I'm going to turn it over to you here to dive into the birds specific to Seabrook, and especially some of those ones that you study very closely.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Matt. So the birds on the screen now, there's just a couple that y'all requested when you submitted your registration. Carolina wren, blue-gray gnatcatcher, great-crested flycatcher, least tern, American oystercatcher, and Wilson's plover. So I'll kind of cover some of those coastal beach nesting birds, and then Matt is going to take over in a little bit to cover more of the songbirds and things other than the birds you see on the beach. And again, definitely encourage questions in the chat. So a lot of the birds that we see on the coast actually don't nest here, especially in the spring, and we're really at the very tail end of spring migration. You really shouldn't see too many migratory shorebirds anymore, but most of the ones that we do see are on their way north. They're just passing through Seabrook Island in South Carolina. The ones that are starred with a red star here are the species that we do see here in South Carolina, but do not nest here. And they're going up to the Arctic to nest. But however, there are a few that do nest in South Carolina. And most of these do nest on Seabrook Island. So that includes the American oystercatcher, the Wilson's plover, and the willet in the shorebird family. And then we'll also talk about some seabirds, which are more like your terns and your pelicans and your gulls. But I just want to dispel a myth about a shorebird season really quick, because there really is no such thing as a shorebird season. They're here year round. It's just different species at different times of the year. But I also really like this graphic that our friend at the Fish and Wildlife Service, Melissa Chaplin, created, because it shows really where all these seasons line up. And breeding season now for shorebirds started last month and will continue through the end of July. So I'll be talking about 2 shorebirds and then 2 seabirds. So the first is a royal tern, which it would be rare to see them nesting on Seabrook, but I included this one because they have some pretty cool displays that I want to point you to. However, they do probably nest on DeVoe Bank, which is very close to Seabrook Island. So you probably see these royal tern foraging. So this is a video that once it clicks in, there you go. So this is the first step in these royal tern nesting behavior. This is one of those courtship displays. The male will puff out their chest and act like they're taller than they really are, and try and female. So that one in the back that's walking all goofy. That's the male, just looking for a female. And when I've watched this myself, it honestly looks like the male is just bugging the crud out of all the females on the beach until he, you know, he's swinging a miss, swinging a miss, swinging a miss until finally he's successful. So then the next step after they kind of choose each other is they'll actually, y'all may have seen this. This is truly some National Geographic stuff that's right in our backyards. So royal tern pairs will fly up and very high into the sky together, and then all of a sudden you'll see them break off and do this flight in unison back down to the ground, this cool spiral together, and it's every single movement is mimicked by the other one. So that's a sign that it's nesting season, and it usually happens right now. What's pictured though is another aerial display. It's when one of them gets a fish, the other ones usually chase them like a big old dog fight. But then these royal tern will spend all season long protecting eggs and then protecting chicks. And that includes bringing fish back to that chick that has to eat a ton of food every single day in order to grow up and grow their adult feathers and learn how to fly. So then later on, probably, you're probably seeing this a little bit right now, but especially towards the end of this month, you'll see royal tern coming back and forth with fish all the time. Uh-oh, I'm freezing over here.
Well, turn your heat up. Yeah, it is frozen. This is a good reminder to put your questions in the chat if you have them as we go along, or if you want to talk about your favorite tern. I like these terns. The other thing that I'm going to put in the chat that I meant to mention at the beginning is if you would like to learn more about what Audubon is doing, I am going to put a link in there that's specific to this talk tonight that you can fill out if you would like to get on our mailing list or learn more about what Audubon South Carolina is specifically doing. It also perhaps is a good time to mention that we are a membership organization and depend on donations. And if you donate directly to Audubon South Carolina through our website, would probably be the easiest way to do it, that your money goes to support Audubon's work here in South Carolina. Have I covered enough, Nolan, for us to be caught up?
Yeah, I got it here. My apologies. Is that up again? Okay. Sorry about that. So the next bird that I wanted to mention is the American oystercatcher. So now we're coming into the shorebird territory. These are birds that are more solitary, and I like this. I love this picture that was actually taken by Dana Beach of the oystercatcher in front of the royal tern colony, because while the royal terns love to nest in big numbers, it's safety and power in numbers. American oystercatchers and every shorebird that nests in South Carolina prefers to be on their own. They defend a territory, they are cryptic, and like to hide their nest as opposed to having power in numbers. So they will often nest in and among other seabird colonies. And so actually in the winter, we have over a third of the entire Atlantic population of American oystercatchers in our state. They love to roost on shell rakes and high spots during high tides along the intercoastal waterway and in our marshes and on our beaches. But then after the winter season is over, we get into March and April, they'll start to break off and spread out along the whole coast, all the way up to almost Maine and down into Mexico and Central America. So we only have about 400 pairs that nest in the state. And I want to show another video. Hopefully this isn't the thing that froze us, but just a quick clip of some of their really cool courtship behavior. Is not so much trying to impress their mate, but it's more so keeping other pairs away from their designated territory. so they do this bucking back and forth, and I forgot to turn the sound on, so you probably can't hear. It's this loud, raucous, squeaky sounds back and forth the entire time. But the only time they do this bucking behavior where they bob their head up and down and push their chest out is when there's another pair or another individual too close to that couple's territory. And so what you're seeing now is they're literally drawing that territory line with other pairs, saying, this is mine, okay, that's yours, this is mine. And if one bird steps over that line, then that's when you'll see them jump over that line and start to attack and chase each other off. There you go, that's a little chase in there. So in addition to nesting on the beach, which y'all do have a pair on Seabrook that has come back, I think now for 8 years. They also nest on shell rakes along the intercoastal waterway once again. And that picture to the right is a picture of an oystercatcher nest. And if you're having trouble seeing those eggs, then you're not alone. That is an intentional strategy that these American oystercatchers employ in order to protect their eggs. So 1, 2, 3 eggs are at the very bottom of that picture. And you can see those eggs blend in so well with the surrounding environment. I believe this picture was taken by Ed Conrad. And this is the bird that has come back to Seabrook year after year after year to nest. That red band on their leg tells us that this is an individual and separates it out from any of the other American oystercatchers that you might see. So U5, that's your bird. That's Seabrook's bird. And so ultimately what we want to see after these birds pair up and start to lay eggs is they will, oh shoot, I think I'm freezing again. My apologies, everybody. That U5 bird was banded at Little Egg Island in Georgia, just north of Little St. Simon's Island, if you've ever been there. Sorry, y'all, 1 second. I got to restart this again.
Hey, Nolan, while you're doing that, I know one of our members, Judy, was having problems where you were in the big screen, which is great to look at you, Nolan, but the images were in the small screen. And if anyone else has that problem, there is an option that says swap shared screen with video, and that should swap so that the speaker, Nolan or Matt, are in the small box, and the big full screen would be the presentation. So that would be found, I'm looking at the image of the speakers, and there's a single line, a kind of double line separated, 9 boxes, and then over to the far right is where it says swap screen. So just want to mention that.
I don't know why anybody would not want to just look at me the whole time though. Obviously just kidding. So what we really want to see here with American oystercatchers is them pairing up, doing their thing undisturbed. But we'll skip past that picture quick. That's a little X-rated content. Chicks hatching out of their eggs successfully, and this means that the parents have successfully stayed on top of that nest for about a month, shading those eggs from the sun. And then those chicks grow up to where the adults are able to teach them how to feed. Now, this is a very unique thing with American oystercatchers. They're actually the only shorebird that nests in South Carolina that the parents have to teach the young how to eat. So because they have such a specialized feeding behavior, those bills are shaped just like an oyster knife. The parents will go pluck a single oyster out of an oyster bed, bring it back to the beach, and teach that young how to scissor into it, snip the abductor muscle of that oyster, and get the meat out. Another picture of that awesome behavior. So if you are ever on the beach and see a single oyster just pried open, it was probably your neighbor, and I don't mean a human neighbor, but your American oystercatcher neighbor on the beach teaching this young how to eat. So the next bird is also a shorebird. My second.
Yeah, Nolan, there was one question that I might as well throw out there.
Yeah.
Melody was wondering, do you or maybe Ed know what year U5 was banded?
Ed might know. I thought it was 2014. Don't quote me on that though.
I think that's about right. We've been seeing it for 6 years or so, 6 or 7. So that sounds about right. Yes.
Okay. Awesome. And who knows, maybe that bird's parents were visiting Seabrook even before it came here.
Yeah, just Nolan, just real quick.
Yeah.
We had heard that U5 and its mate had nested at the end of North Beach, but the nest wasn't successful. Possibly crows, as someone in Pennsylvania talked about, and they looked as if they were trying to nest again. Okay. So.
Nice. And that actually brings up a really great point. Thank you, Ed, because most coastal birds, I mean, they face a whole lot of threats, including human disturbance, and then human disturbance leads to increased depredation by crows or raccoons. But if they lose their eggs, their first brood, then they can try again. And usually they'll try a maximum of 3 times before the nesting season is over and they're out of energy and resources to be able to do that. So fingers crossed, U5 nests again on the beach. So Wilson's plovers, and actually these are points that were created and drafted up by Ed and Aya, and Nancy, and I think Mark too, while we were planning the Shorebird steward training. But they're similar to oystercatchers. There are about 400 nesting pairs in the state. These guys are most likely to tolerate human disturbance, which is the leading threat for shorebirds in South Carolina. Both parents tend to the young, both the male and female, and it's usually just 3 eggs that they lay in each nest. So they'll lay what's called a scrape, or in a scrape, and this is their version of a nest. So it's literally just a 2-inch deep hole in the sand that they plop their eggs right into, and this plays into or contributes to that idea of a cryptic nesting species. The first thing that they'll do when a predator gets too close is stand up, and you see that in the top left picture. The next thing they'll do, however, is run away if you keep getting too close. And that leaves the eggs and the chicks exposed to the sun, the hot sun, which they can only tolerate in the middle of the day for about a minute or 2. And that's why these birds have to spend all day, every day, shading those eggs and shading those chicks. I'm hesitant to even play this video because I think that's what keeps freezing everything, but I'll try it nonetheless. This is a video of a piping plover. I just found this on YouTube, piping plover broken wing display, but this is what Wilson's plovers do. This is their 3rd and final defense mechanism against predators. They will pretend to have a broken wing. I actually don't really like that the videographer stayed this close for this long taking this video, but it is a good tool to use in presentations like this. It makes hurt sounding little squeaky noises. So if you see this on the beach, this is a sign that you're too close to a Wilson's plover's nest, and you should take a few steps back. So finally, my last species here is the least tern. So there are, majority actually nest on rooftops in the state. There's a little over a dozen colonies on rooftops, but Seabrook Island historically has been one of those beach sites, which is really what we want to see. And this is a string of pictures from Ed Conrad again. I love this string of pictures. He captured this so well. But least tern males will bring down a fish to gift to a female. And so first he'll find the female, try and wag that shiny silverfish around, trying to get their attention. And it doesn't always work. That female was not interested. So I don't know if it was the quality of the feathers or the quality of the fish, but female, not interested, was rejected. But sometimes this works. And the female will take that fish and eat it. And that's a pretty proud looking male, if you ask me, that male to the left. But again, this is kind of what we want to see. And these birds have to shade the chicks and the eggs, just like the Wilson's plover and oystercatchers do. Unless there are any other questions, this is my turn to pass it over to Matt.
Thanks, Nolan. I have a question for everyone, and it's a very important burning one. And we debate this off the
Oh, no.
Audubon office. Is it plover or plover? If we're talking about the Wilson's plover, is it plover or is it Wilson's plover? This is highly debated. We would love to know your answer. If you put it in the chat, you can put the emphasis where you would like, but it is a highly contested topic within the office at Audubon.
And just for the record, the right answer is plover.
Plover. The right answer is plover. Thanks, Nolan. So, you know, obviously you see a lot of diversity in terms of the nesting, courtship, the whole process within our sea and shorebirds. And I think what you'll find is that it's equally as diverse amongst our, what I'll call land birds, forest birds. Obviously there are lots, and we really probably won't touch on a lot of things like wading birds or marsh birds this evening. So if y'all have questions about specific ones, please ask, but I'm going to kind of mention a few of the species that that some of y'all have asked about, or that we get a lot of questions about, that are birds that you might see in your yard or within sort of more of the forested areas on Seabrook. So I think, Nolan, let's move on to the first. So what I don't like, I was telling Nolan, what I don't like to do is I have a list of birds, and I didn't want to just run down them one by one. I like to put it in sort of some context, right? So to me, and I see somebody says they're a plover lover. I am right there with you. Plover lover too. Amen. What I wanted to do to start with is cover some of the birds that y'all asked specifically about, but that all kind of nest in a similar way, and that they are cavity nesters. So these are birds that want to nest inside of a structure. So that could be in a hollow tree. This could be in a cavity that they created, or it could be a cavity that something else created and they have taken over. So for birds that are taking over, or that are moving into a cavity created by another organism or another bird, we would call those secondary cavity nesters. They are making use of that cavity that already exists. And so, you know, for long time, these were openings in hollow trees and limbs primarily that would have existed, that these birds would have used. Now we see them making use of sometimes things around our houses, and or artificially created birdhouses or nest boxes. So you're going to hear me talk quite a bit about nest boxes tonight. I changed mine up a little bit in the sense that I did not, somebody got it right. I did not put the name of the bird until you would have to click again. So if you want to play a little fun trivia, we'll see who can first type in the chat the correct name of every bird that pops up. Somebody already said great crested flycatcher. That is the bird pictured here. Gorgeous flycatcher. In fact, it's our only eastern flycatcher that's a cavity nester. So great crested flycatchers tend to nest higher up in the canopy in a cavity. They would not create their own cavity. They'd be using a cavity created by a woodpecker or another organism. Tends to be higher up in a bare limb or a hollow tree. And I'll kind of pepper throughout some backyard tips for things that you can do. And one of them is where it is safe to do so, leaving or keeping dead trees or dead limbs, obviously not close to your house, but if it is out in a way where it's not going to harm anything, those are great things to leave, because a variety of different birds use them, but not just birds, a variety of other animals as well, including great crested flycatchers. I did not include the sound, but they do make a very distinct sound. And if you want to follow along on your whatever your favorite bird app is and play the sounds, because this is one that sometimes you hear, they make a very distinct sound. This sending single note that's very distinctive.
Matt, do you want me to look up the sounds and play them as you go?
I would love it if you did. If it doesn't delay us too much, if you can keep up with me, I would love it if you did.
People that say plover versus plover can usually keep up. pretty.
Okay. All right. Okay. I see what you it hurt, but I see.
I'm ready to play it when you
Play it away. That's not the sound I was thinking of. But that is and obviously birds make multiple sounds. But if, pretty close. Okay, we can cut it off now. But a very distinct sound, and I guess what I'm trying to say is a very vocal bird. A very vocal bird. They, I think it's a great bird to have around because they eat lots of insects and they really like spiders. I see them eating like big wolf spiders, so they're a great one to have around if you don't like spiders. If you do, there's probably enough spiders to go around. But a bird that we do see nesting in our area now that probably have nests already developed in those cavities that I think they tend to do one. So you'll hear me say, you probably hear me use the word clutch, which tends to refer to the number of eggs. Brood is talking about sort of the whole nesting cycle. So the number of eggs is, I'm actually not quite sure what it is in great crested flycatchers. But if you hear me say clutch, I'm referring to the number of eggs. If we are talking about a brood, we're talking about how many. You may hear me say something like 1 to 3 brood, meaning they would try to nest 1 to 3 times. And great crested flycatchers, like a lot of our migrants, so this is a bird that spends its winter in Central and South America, they tend to have only 1 brood, although some of them will do 2.
Hey, Matt, I just wanted to mention that we have a pair nesting in our gutter downspout, and I covered up the whole gutter except for the part over the downspout so that they wouldn't get flooded out in our downpours. And the good news is the eggs hatched, and there's babies up there, and they're feeding them, and we're hoping that they fledge shortly. But you mentioned the sound. I can hear the one of them right outside my window now making that sound you were talking about.
I feel like maybe even I can hear it in the background of your recording. Very loud. That is very cool. Thank you for sharing, Bill. You know, one thing I'll also say quickly, because I've got other birds to talk about, and we'll move on, but it made me remember that this is a bird that you can put up nest boxes for too. So great to see, and it's a cool thing that they're nesting in your downspout. If you would rather they not nest there next year, maybe thinking about a nest box. The thing about nest boxes with great crested flycatchers is that they need to be kind of high, so like 15 feet or higher, for it to be kind of at a level that they want to be. So maybe somewhere, if there's somewhere close to that downspout, and maybe they'll use that versus the downspout next year, or you could just keep the downspout.
Well, I'll probably put something over it so they nest in a tree. But
I think that's smart. Other cavity nesters, I think some of y'all are familiar with. I saw somebody already answered the question. Our woodpeckers. All of our woodpeckers are cavity nesters. These are birds that will create their cavities, as we know and hear probably very often. I picked just a couple of species here. I think you already know. On the left, we have our largest woodpecker in North America, the pileated woodpecker. On the right is red-bellied woodpecker. Yes, correct. One of the most common woodpeckers that we have in the eastern United States and in South Carolina. We also see downy woodpeckers. And in terms of other woodpeckers that nest out on Seabrook, those might be the 3, unless I am missing one. Perhaps hairy woodpeckers, I'm guessing.
No.
Yeah, probably not. They're kind of rare in South Carolina. Rarer, not uncommon in South Carolina. So we tend to see smaller clutches in our woodpeckers, usually 5 or less eggs, and then they'll usually tend to do just one brood. Pileateds take a while too. You can imagine to create a pileated woodpecker. If any of y'all have ever seen one up close, they are monsters. They're big birds. I've had depending on how you look at it, the privilege or it maybe wasn't quite a privilege to ban one, and my hand and my colleagues' hands were left with bruises and bloody, but a very large and powerful bird. It takes almost a month for that nestling period. So the time between when the eggs hatch and when those young are able to leave the nest takes almost 4 weeks, and it takes about 2 weeks for the eggs to hatch. So a 6 weeks period. When you think about pileated, red bellies, a little smaller, not quite as long. Other cavity nesters that we see in the area and that I think nest out on Seabrook include, I think, a bird that we're all familiar with. And I am waiting for Nolan to, there we go. Thank you, Nolan. Eastern bluebird. Oh, I gave it away. I'm assuming a lot of y'all know the eastern bluebird. Not our only bluebird in South Carolina, but one that I think we're all familiar with. I am thinking maybe some of y'all, maybe a good put thumbs up if this is a bird that you see in your yard or that you know is nesting in your yard. Just be curious to see how many of y'all are seeing them regularly. I see a lot of thumbs up. That's great. This is a bird that was in decline in the mid 1900s, and it was a lot of their success came from bluebird boxes and bluebird trails and people putting up artificial nest boxes for bluebirds to use. And you see two photos here, one on the left with a natural cavity, one on the right with one of those nest boxes. It's an easy nest box to make. The birds tend to take to them. And I'll share some resources towards the end if any of y'all are really interested in terms of how to, where to go about in terms of nest box size and the entrance hole. And that we do see different entrance hole sizes recommended for different species, obviously. So I'll give some resources about that as we go along. But this is a bird that'll have, so why were they in decline? Lack of cavities. So, used to be that cavities were widespread. Not as much now, especially sort of in more urban and suburban areas. And so I think also habitat protection, a variety of other factors that happen in the 60s and 70s, starting in the 60s and 70s, but also the fact that birds take so readily to artificially created nest boxes is one of the main reasons that they have rebounded. This is a bird that'll have multiple broods, so it'll nest multiple times throughout the summer, usually twice at least sometimes 3 times. I don't know about you all, but in my yard where I have, and I'm up in Somerville where I have bluebirds nesting. I have fledglings on the feeder, and in the female is already in the nest box for her second brood. So they're on their second, may try a third. A lot of times they'll do 2, but usually they'll do more than 1. And they usually have anywhere from 2 to 7 eggs. Usually it's 4 or 5 really pretty blue eggs. It's an interesting thing in bluebirds. Only the female builds the nest, but the male helps. He'll fly over to the nest box or to the cavity, and he'll bring food, and he'll fly in and out and sit on top of the nest box, but he doesn't really do anything to help with the nest building process. I guess he's just there for support. An important thing to mention really quick about bluebirds in particular is they are affected by house sparrows and starlings. So trying to make sure that only the bluebirds are using your bluebird box and that throughout other times of the year, they're not being used by house sparrows or starlings is an important thing, because those two birds will evict bluebirds from their nest boxes, and neither of those are native. So you can be creative in your ways of dispelling them. Cool. Bluebird Trail out on Seabrook. That's great to hear. I'm sure you'll see lots of really beautiful bluebirds. You got a lot of great habitat for them out there as well. Moving on to our last of the cavity nesters that I'll mention are our owls. At least 3 of the 4 species of owls that we see. And I am guessing both of these species of owls nest on Seabrook. Do we see, owl on the left, if you want to put it into the chat, if y'all know that, it's our smallest species of owl. Eastern screech. Good job, everyone. Screech owls. That very cool sounds. I hope that's one that y'all get to hear often. And on the right, yes, barred owl, one of our most common owls in in the eastern United States. But both of these species of owls are cavity nester. Does anybody know the third that is a cavity nester that we see in South Carolina? The third species of owl that's a cavity nester. You can put that in the chat if you know. But this is another bird that utilizes cavities, either artificial cavities or nest boxes, especially screech owls, which will use boxes that are designed for screech owls, or even things like wood duck boxes are popular with screech owls. Barred owls tend to use more natural cavities, and they tend to be near water. As some of y'all may know, screech owls, I think, are a little bit up in the drier areas. And actually, barred owls and other owls, great horned owls as well, will outcompete screech owls. So it's like kind of an owl I worry about a little bit. I think their numbers are relatively stable, but they get picked on by some of the bigger species of owls. Somebody says they know where I got this photo. Yes, the photo on the left came from Deweese Island. We were doing a spring bird count out there and had a screech owl watching us from a wood duck, actually a wood duck nest box. The other species of owl, real quick, I'll say before we go on, that nest in cavities. Somebody asked if it was great horn. No, but Nancy got it, is barn owl. The barn owl nests in cavities, and actually they do really well in some areas in South Carolina because also because of a lot of artificial boxes put up for them to nest in at places like Bear Island, Santee Coastal Reserve, places like that. Moving on, I want to just cover a few of the species that we see really close. I call them backyard nesters. These are birds that might nest in your yard or even closer, like in your house. Some of y'all know this one. Yeah, state bird, Carolina wren. On the left, you see it in a natural cavity. But I feel like wrens tend to be, I describe it as wrens tend to nest somewhere that you would rather that they not. Like a wreath on your front door, in your garage, under a grill cover, and we'll build that nest really quickly. And we get a lot of calls of like, can I move the nest? It's really in a bad spot. We always tell people the nesting process is pretty quick when it comes to Carolina wrens. Just leave them be. This picture on the right here is kind of hard to tell, but this is at Beidler Forest. For those of you that have been there, on our back deck, we keep a bike, and it used to have this basket on it. And this is, right where we get all of our foot traffic at the center. And this Carolina wren just nested in this bike, in this basket on the bike. And this is me taking the photo through the window from about, I don't know, a foot away. And it didn't really seem to care. We had people walking in and out of the center all day long. The wrens, they really didn't seem to mind at all. And they've really adapted well to people. I'm seeing some questions coming in. I'm going to just keep moving in an effort to keep us going on time, but we can try to hit some of these at the end. A couple others I want to just mention. Another cavity nester that's also a backyard nester is the chickadee, Carolina chickadee. Another one that you all see a lot that visits bird feeders. Builds a very shallow nest, only a couple of inches tall, and it's always usually lined with mosses. A very, very pretty nest. Usually, can have a large clutch, usually sometimes up to 10 eggs, but usually it does one brood. Usually only has one nesting process. The thing I want to mention about Carolina wrens and throughout is, and for a lot of these birds, great crested flycatchers, woodpeckers, wrens, chickadees, they eat lots of insects. And even if as an adult, they eat lots of seeds, they feed insects to their young. And for chickadees, there's been some studies that have shown that it's like upwards of 9,000 like caterpillars that they feed to their nestlings in the 2-week period, in that 2-week nestling period. Think about that for just a second. Like, that's a lot. That's back and forth all day long. And the theme from a backyard perspective that I like to try to get across when we talk about nesting birds is that bird, and Nolan, you can click to the next slide because this is a great example. Another bird that y'all are familiar with that eats a lot of seeds as an adult is still feeding nestlings insects, and they need a lot of insects in the vicinity of the nest in order for that brood to be successful. And so you'll hear me at the end mention native plants. And native plants host insects that feed birds, particularly baby birds and migrating birds. So One thing that anybody can do to improve their yard for birds is to make sure that they have a lot of native plants. So yes, this is the cardinals. And I'll just say quickly, this is another bird that can nest, usually not in your house, but very close to your house. If you have shrubs close to your house, a lot of times they nest in it. One really quick thing I'll mention about cardinals that I think is kind of interesting. They're one of the few birds where females will sing. Most of our songbirds, only the males do the singing, which they do to defend a territory and attract a mate. In cardinals, you'll see females sing. And when they sing, they generally sing from the nest. And I think that that's a way for them to be in touch with the male, who will often bring them food while they're on the nest. And so it's thought to be sort of a communication thing between that pair. Okay, 3 others I want to quickly mention that overlap a lot, and that a few of you asked about, are what I call moss nesters. These are birds that a lot of times nest in clumps of moss. Here, this looks like reindeer moss or some other species because this was the photo I could find. But in South Carolina, that's generally Spanish moss. So if you've ever seen a northern parula in your yard, which is a type of warbler that we see throughout South Carolina, it's one of our more common warblers. They tend to be in the treetops. This is another one. Let's not do it now because we're running long on time. But listen to their song, because you hear this song in the background throughout the spring and summer. But the birds tend to be higher up. If you've ever spotted one, I've had this happen to me before, and they're flying across, and all of a sudden there's like a clump of Spanish moss and they disappear. It's probably because they have a nest in that clump of Spanish moss. So they'll actually get inside that moss, build a little cup-shaped nest, and nest directly within it. And another one that we have in our area, and I bet there's a lot on Seabrook. I hear somebody playing the song. Go for it. I can hear it. It's kind of hard to hear. There you go. It's a buzzy ascending song. Zzz. And another one that nests in Spanish moss that we see in South Carolina, and especially I would imagine out on Seabrook, is a close relative of the northern parula, another type of warbler. This is the as it probably looks, the yellow-throated warbler. Also one that nests in clumps of Spanish moss. We see these, in a lot of different types of habitats, generally where there are large trees. You see them in wetlands, but also up in more deciduous, dry woodlands. And they nest early in the year. If for any of y'all that may be familiar with yellow-throated warblers, they were one of our first migrants to show back up into South Carolina. And some of y'all may be in birding in the winter along the coast, find a yellow-throated warbler in the winter. They do occur in very small numbers in South Carolina, but generally are here during the breeding season. But I don't know, somebody can weigh in the chat. I start hearing them like early March, sometimes late in February, and they nest early in the year. And by now, a lot of them have quieted down. I don't even hear very many yellow-throated warblers singing now. They nest pretty early in the breeding season. So that goes back to that idea of phenology that we were talking about earlier. And then one last one that I know you all maybe are curious about, one of our best known birds is, well, before I tell you which one, here is a picture of a nest of this bird that I took in Somerville. I saw this bird go into this clump of Spanish moss. It is kind of left of center and below midway where it gets a little thicker. And if you click one more time, Nolan, I think I have a little bit more close up. That is the nest of this bird right there in the middle. Yes, somebody got it. Painted bunting. Yes, this is the painted bunting nest. So they also will nest in clumps of Spanish moss. Not always, usually in any sort of little thicket area, but they want to be along an edge generally. So think about like where field meets forest. And along that edge, they'll find a little secluded spot. But I watched a female painted bunting bringing nesting material into this little clump right there in the middle of this. And I think if you click, Nolan, I have a photo of the painted bunting as we know the male. Very pretty. Obviously, I've always heard of the description of it looks like it leapt off the pages of a child's coloring book. And I always thought that was a great description of the male. Females are all green. I didn't include a photo here. I should have. They're an olive green for those of you that aren't familiar. And an interesting thing about painted buntings that some of y'all know, that a lot of you probably know, is the male painted bunting in its first year of life is also all green. They don't turn this color until their second year of life. So the painted bunting is born right now and it is a male. It will spend the entire rest of this year and into next spring being all green. And sometime at the end of next year, it will turn this multicolored form that we think of it. Somebody asked about height. That's a great question. Usually at 10 feet off the ground or higher, somewhere in that range, 10 to 15 feet off of the ground is where we see their nests. This is a bird that Audubon has been studying. We've been putting geolocators, tracking devices on them to study their migration. It's one that we're really concerned about in terms of habitat loss, but also, Nolan, I can see you adjusting your background. The exotic pet trade. This is one that we're worried about. It gets trapped. Not only just in it happens probably in South Carolina. We see it happen in Georgia, Florida, and also on the wintering grounds. And they show up in cages and are sold across the world. So that's something that a lot of groups are working on. Okay, Nolan, you can click through. And I think I have just two more I want to highlight very quickly. Another one that you all asked about. Nolan, were you able to pick up the nest of this bird at the office today? You did not. Oh, no. I am seeing him shake his head. We have a nest of one of these birds at the office. Does anybody know this one? You can actually see here the adult bird. And if you look right below the beak of the adult bird, you see the baby bird's head poking up. This is, yes, I see somebody put blue-gray. That is half of it. I assume that you know that it is also blue-gray gnatcatcher, the blue-gray gnatcatcher, but that is its nest right there. And that is that little nestling sticking its head up. And I think, Nolan, we can try it. There is a video of this particular nest taken by my a friend and fellow birder, Brad Sale, at Old Santee Canal Park. And let's see if it plays. You may have to click. No. Maybe it will not play. Anyway, you again can see the you can see the little, don't worry about it, Nolan. You can see the nestling sticking its head out there, but a really cool nest that's usually in a cup of a cup, like a branch, a fork in a tree, and lined with lichens. And that was why I was hoping Nolan maybe had that one, and that's okay, Nolan, but they're very, very camouflaged. But this is a nest I think that people see a lot or find a lot because blue-gray gnatcatchers apparently make a lot of nests. Like they'll make something like 6 or 7 different nests, and they may only use one of them. And so I think people find the nests a lot and they think it's a hummingbird nest. And so if you click to the next slide, Nolan, then this is the species I'll kind of end on. We do see the hummingbird here. And if you find a very small nest and it's maybe smaller than your fist and you're like, this must be a hummingbird nest, most likely it is not. A hummingbird nest would be the size of it was described as the size of a large thimble. So think about 2 inches across, about 1 inch deep. So tiny little nest. And look at the nestling. I mean, I can't even, it's adorable. Their eggs are like, I think it was like 1/4 of an inch in diameter. So tiny. This, if any of y'all know your hummingbirds well, is not a ruby-throated hummingbird, which is the primary hummingbird that we have in the eastern United States. In fact, really the only nesting hummingbird that we have. Not a rufous. I think this is a broad-billed, and I'm sorry, but in my access to the photos that I have, we did not have a good nest shot of a ruby-throated hummingbird. If any of y'all have one and would be willing to share it, I would love to add it. But this is, I think, a broad-billed hummingbird, but you get the idea, same general idea, very, very small nest, also usually lined with lichens, and usually they'll take spider webs and weave it into the nest to create this really tight, tiny, itty-bitty little nest, which is pretty amazing. Couple of things I want to mention real quick. I know we're running long, but a couple of things I want to mention real quick. One of them we already talked about at the outset with a question about fledglings. But these questions come up a lot, and I just want to hit a couple of them really quick. One, The baby bird myth, somehow it feels like we all grew up learning that you shouldn't touch a baby bird because the parents would abandon it. That is not true. I learned that. I don't know. I'm not quite sure where that comes from. You can, and if it is a nestling, if it cannot fly, if it does not have feathers on it and it is on the ground and you know where the nest is, you should pick it up and put it back. If you want, put on a pair of gloves, that's fine. But by touching it, it is not going to cause the parents to abandon it. And the general rule, when do you interfere, when do you not? As I was mentioning earlier, if it is fuzzy or pink or doesn't really have feathers, you should interfere and try to get it back into the nest if you know where the nest is. If you don't, you should try to get it to a wildlife rehabber. If it has feathers and it's hopping around but it can't fly and the parents are around and it appears uninjured, you should leave it alone. Even if it's on the ground in your yard, unless you have some sort of predator that you know is around, the best thing that you can do is leave it be. It is learning to fly. It's like learning to ride a bike. There are some bumps and bruises for that bird along the way, but generally it is best to leave it alone. If for some reason a nest is in an area that you do not want it, we always advise leave it. It's usually a quick process. It may be inconvenient, especially if it's like on your door wreath and you are worried about opening your door. You probably have another door somewhere that you can use for a couple of weeks. So we always advise to just leave it, let it play out. And a lot of times if it's something like a Carolina wren or a house finch are also notorious for doing that, you can kind of watch the whole nesting process play out very carefully. And it's a really cool way to get to see the whole thing happen. I'm sure a lot of y'all have done that. And nest boxes, I'm going to save that. I have a resource on one of the other slides, Nolan, so we can click through. But nest boxes are great for a lot of these species. So you can vary the entrance hole, the height. There's a lot of different things to know. But maybe I'll throw it over to you for just a couple minutes, Nolan, because I know you had a few things that you wanted to mention when it comes to nests, nestlings, and fledglings in regards to beach birds.
Yeah, thank you. So this is the same stuff that we preach each and every year, especially this time of year in the spring and the summer. But this text was actually pulled from our website at our Let 'em Rest, Let 'em Nest webpage, and we'll show you the link to that a little later. But I mean, there are such simple things that we can do, and we can try and spread throughout your own community. When it comes to respecting the space of a lot of these birds. So they're only here for a few months out of the year and really only use a very small sliver of the beach. But if we can keep away from birds, respect the posted nesting and feeding areas, and keep pets on a leash, which Seabrook does so well thanks to the new leash laws that are active on the island as of recently, then these birds will have a very successful nesting season. Be mindful of where you land your boat. If anybody has a boat and takes it on the weekend, I'm very jealous. I'd love to get to know you personally and go out on your boat with you, but please be respectful of where you land that boat. Some islands are off limits, and if you see birds using the beach, maybe try and find another spot to land. And then, of course, teaching others to share some of these values. How close is too close? Well, some of our friends in Texas started a slogan that was fish, swim, and play from 50 yards away. About half the length of a football field is the distance you should keep between you and any coastal birds you see on the beach. And similar to nesting birds in your backyard, you can actually see a lot more interesting behaviors if you maintain your distance and just watch. You'll see them naturally behaving as they would if you weren't even there. So here's that link at the bottom of this page for the something that if you want to, you could share on Facebook or just refer to if you ever want to see those 7 steps again. It's sc.audubon.org/LERLAN. It stands for Let 'em Rest, Let 'em Nest. Matt, do you want to cover the rest of these points?
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly, you heard me talk a lot about insects, and I mentioned it earlier, but native plants, I can't stress enough how important they are. So kind of assessing your yard, regardless of where you are, whether you're on Seabrook right now or not, do you have native plants that are going to provide those insects? And when I mean insects, I don't mean like, biting flies and things like that. I mean the caterpillars, inchworms, the creepy crawlies that we generally don't know are there, that are feeding those birds. So native plants are adapted to the region, insects are adapted to the plants, birds are adapted to the insects. It kind of all works together. So Audubon has a lot of great resources on our website for finding native plants. There's some great native plant nurseries here in Charleston. One that we recommend a lot is called Roots and Shoots, that is open and has a great selection. So I can't stress that enough. And then remember that those birds, you know, especially things like bluebirds, they're foraging for insects on the ground. And so trying to limit putting out insecticides or pesticides of any kind, especially during the breeding season, is really important, again, so we can have those insects that are feeding those birds. And then I wanted to provide this nestwatch.org link. You know, so if you're curious in putting up nest boxes, instead of me trying to like rattle off details about all the different ones for all the different birds, this is a great resource. You can download a blueprint if you want to build it yourself. Obviously, there's a lot of places that you could go ahead and buy them if you wanted to, but they give sort of the specifics on like, oh, you want to have a bluebird, the entrance hole should be about this big, the height should be about this high. So there's some great resources at nestwatch.org. And then lastly, I think just wanted to end with kind of what we started with, which is being a voice for birds and for birders. You know, birds need it now more than ever. And, you know, we would love for you all to join what Audubon is doing, do it on your own, but just be a voice for these organisms that we love and for safe access for everybody to get out and to be able to enjoy them. So I think that's all I have, Nolan. I think we should probably say real quick that all of these great photos have a lot of folks have shared them with us. So we have some, just want to click through the photo credits that we have for a lot of these great ones. If anybody has a specific question about a photo that they saw, we would be happy to call out the author or the creator, the photographer. And then I think that's all we have. So if there are any questions that we haven't answered in the chat, we can try to answer them, or haven't answered while we've been talking. Or if you have others, please add them in. I see a few, but Nancy, we can turn it back over to you.
Sure. So I know Sherry Vincent has this question, and why don't you take a second to read through the question? And while he's doing that, first of all, I want to get some quick feedback from people. By now you've seen that thumbs up reaction. I am going to ask Nolan if he can stop sharing his screen so that we can see. Yeah, I want to look at the gallery. So I'm seeing some claps and some thumbs up. That's exactly what I wanted to hear is, you know, did you like the format? And is this something that we want to try again? So if you think, you know, you enjoyed this type of a meeting, we'd be happy to organize some more like this. It looks like we're getting some good feedback, and I'm seeing a lot of thank yous for both Matt and Nolan. So we will probably, within the next few days, anyone who missed or wants to replay, I've recorded the event. I'll put that out in a blog and send it to everyone on the email at least. And then the second thing is Judy Moore has put together a questionnaire, because we're trying to figure out how do we move forward as an organization in this time of still socially distancing ourselves and being safe. So we've got a few ideas. We can do more Zoom type presentations or seminars. We also will probably start doing some small group bird walks. So we just want to get your feedback on what you might be interested in. So watch for 2 upcoming blogs, one with some information, some of the links that were shared by Matt and Nolan, and the video, as well as the survey. Matt, do you want to take a shot at a couple things?
Well, I don't really want to give a shot at the bluebird question, because I really have no idea. That is bizarre. To just recap for anybody that maybe is not looking at their chat or doesn't have it, it appears Sherry has a nest. Bluebirds that have nested for several years, or have two nests that bluebirds have nested in for several years. And it seems like this year there were eggs laid. When it came time for them to hatch, the bluebirds started just building another nest over the first nest. And it seems like that happened again. And then now it seems as though they are the third time the eggs have hatched. And the question was, what is happening there, and why are they exhibiting this behavior? Good gracious, I'm not really sure. That is bizarre. I'm not sure. And if anybody does know, please feel free to weigh in. I'm by no means a bluebird expert. Sometimes bluebirds will do that if, well, one, I'm not sure that they would know that the eggs aren't viable, but you will see a lot of times see a nest where the birds lay the eggs and they're in there and they're sitting on it, and then they leave and the eggs never hatch. And that happens quite a bit. Sometimes the eggs aren't viable and they just abandon the nest. Sometimes there is either a predator or something that they perceive as a predator that can cause them to abandon the nest. Generally, when that happens, though, they don't go back to the same nest and try to build a new nest on top of it. So why they're doing that, I'm a little bit perplexed. What I might do if it were happening in my yard is just kind of watch, and maybe you already are, but are there starlings or house sparrows in the area? Where is the placement of the nest? Could you try moving the box? If it's a box, could you try moving it to just a different area and see if
what's his name?
Matt.
Yeah. Oh, Matt. Hi, this is Sherry, and I was the one that asked you the question. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, okay. And I was when I asked several people, they said just leave it alone. You know, eventually, when you know that they're not hatching, you can get rid of the nest. So after the second brood, where they'd made the nest on top of the other one and they didn't hatch, then I went in to clean it out. And when I went to pull it out, swarms of, I don't know if they were mites, ants, what they were, because swarm of them came out, and I just, knocked them off my arm and knocked the nest out. And I'm just wondering whether those could have come before and done something to the eggs, or whether they came after the eggs were already.
So that's good information. And I think I heard the person next to you suggest maybe mites, and that's what comes to my mind. Or ants is another possibility. It sounds like could be some sort of either parasite or other nest issue going on there. Again, it kind of is perplexing that they would come back to that same box, but it could be that that's the only cavity that they have access to in the area. So, that brings up a point which comes up a lot of, should you clean out a nest from a nest box of something like a bluebird or a wren after they have used it? The answer to that question is generally yes, if you know that they are done. If you have been watching it, you know that those baby birds have fledged, they're out and they're gone. It's generally a good idea to clear out the old nest. And one of the reasons is because every time birds nest, mites generally get into the nest. Most of the time, birds, the mites don't affect the birds enough to influence their success, but they can build up in a nest, especially in something like a nest box, which is small and confined. So one of the reasons to remove the nest is to get those mites out of there. So if you are using a nest box and you're experiencing that, that nest box most likely really needs to be cleaned. If they're coming out in large quantities, if it were me, I would not do it now. I would wait until like the winter or late fall and just clean out that nest box, or maybe it's time to upgrade to a new nest box. But if you're seeing that, it could have something to do with mites, and a good idea might be to either seriously clean or upgrade your nest box to something that doesn't have those mites in it.
When I asked about cleaning too, I was thinking maybe you needed something like Clorox, and the person I talked to said, don't use anything, but just get a brush and just clean it out with a brush, and don't put any other chemicals or.
Yeah, I wouldn't use. I would not use I wouldn't use bleach. Although in some cases you can use a very dilute bleach solution. What I usually do or recommend is, and especially if you can get it to somewhere where it's easy to clean, is you can use like some antibacterial dish soap and just scrub it very well, and then rinse it very well, and then let it dry very well. I mean, a lot of that depends is what is it made out of? Is it plastic or is it wooden? So, it kind of depend, and just for general information, it could be different from nest box to nest box. But I would not clean it. Yeah, I would probably avoid a bleach. I think you could use some sort of dish soap if you wanted. But I do think the most important thing is that it gets scrubbed. And I think that's the same goes for, and I'll say this quickly, a different topic, feeders. Bird feeders need to be cleaned regularly as well. If you're putting out bird feeders, same thing. A lot of people suggest some sort of dilute bleach solution. I personally suggest soap and water, but the scrubbing I think is important. Scrub around those entrance holes where the birds are sticking their heads in, where that food is touching and where mold might be accumulating. Especially now when it's getting hot and humid, cleaning those feeders regularly, but I think it also applies to your nest box as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I saw the question real quick about Beidler. Somebody asked if Beidler was opening. It's unfortunate. I think so. We're going to be closed at least into the end of this month. Our hope is that maybe at the beginning of July we can reopen, but we're still not sure on that at all. In fact, that's true for all Audubon centers in terms of the buildings. So we are trying to get back open as soon as we can, when it's safe for staff and our volunteers and visitors. So I don't have a date yet. I'm hoping by sometime in July, which would get people out to still see the last of the prothonotary nesting. But I unfortunately don't have a date at this point. And I will say really quickly, and I'm hogging it, so I'm happy to turn it over to somebody else. But as Nolan put in the chat again, we did put that link in there. So if any of this is of interest to you, or any of the work that we're doing is of interest to you, there is that one link that he just put in the chat. Please take a minute, fill that out. It's just your basic information. If you want to hear from us, and that's just what we send out in South Carolina through Audubon, we would love it if you would do that. And then Nolan also posted the link to Dr. Drew Lanham's event and that program happening tomorrow evening. I know a lot of of us at Audubon will be tuning in for that. We encourage and invite you all to do the same.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Nolan. I think this has been an incredible evening, and it looks like from the feedback, people have really enjoyed it. And it does feel like we've been in your living rooms. Except you have pictures of birds over your head and on your shoulder, so we're not seeing the traditional living room look. But I think it's been
probably fabulous. A good thing.
Yeah. Well, I even had to bring Sophie in here. Flo was entertaining Sophie in the other room, trying to keep her quiet. So many thanks to both of you and all the work that you put in to really specialize a presentation for our members. Many thanks to Ed and Judy and all of the board for Seabrook Island Birders for agreeing to try this out as an option. And I'm looking forward to getting together with many of you in the future on either this format or face-to-face or 6 feet apart or with masks, however we can do it. Because we don't want to miss out on the birding. And it's one of the great things that you can do during this time. So we'll post a few things. I'll put reminders out on Facebook of tomorrow night's event and the other links. And if there's anything else that you guys want me to share, just zip me the email with the information and I can get it out to our members, including those who are on today's event. And we actually have quite a few people on today's event who aren't members. And hopefully, they'll think about joining Audubon or joining our organization and helping us grow together. So unless there's any last words, Ed, is there anything else you want to add? Ed, Naya?
No,
it was a great evening.
Wonderful evening.
I loved it. I hope we can do it again.
Thanks, Matt and Nolan. Excellent.
Yeah. Judy, anything you want to say as president?
No, it's a great job. Thanks for organizing, and thanks, Matt and Nolan, for creating a great presentation for us.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for having us. It was our pleasure. Yes, it was great to see you all virtually, and can't wait to see you all again in person.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome.
Good night.
Well, good night, everyone, and
Night
thanks
all.
for joining.
Night all.